The subcommittee will come to order, and I'd like to recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's subcommittee markup. I am pleased that we are begun to the process of moving some what we believe are common sense bills that will help small business, car racing enthusiasts, and consumers. This committee strives to make our nation's environmental regulations smarter, and that is exactly what these four bills do. Smarter regulations protect public health while also encouraging economic growth and job creation. I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will be constructive so that we can report these bills and provide small business with much needed regulatory relief while also maintaining strong protections for public health and the environment. Today we'll be marking up four bills, which were the subject of a legislative hearing on September 13th of this year. Two of these bills, H.R. 1917 and H.R. 1119, passed this committee and the House floor last Congress. The second two bills address concerns that have been brought to this committee's attention from industries that are being hampered by overburdensome regulation. Those bills have bipartisan support, and I hope we're able to move them expeditiously. H.R. 1917, the BRIC Act, and H.R. 453, which extends new source performance standard deadlines for residential wood heaters, both provide relief to small businesses and both enjoy bipartisan support. These bills help businesses who are being held back by significant compliance costs imposed by environmental regulations, resulting in the loss of jobs and damaged economy. H.R. 1119, the Sense Act, addresses facilities that take coal refuge and turn it into electricity and harmless ash. The ash can then be used to remediate the sites formerly contaminated by coal refuse piles. The bill before us simply allows for an alternative compliance method under the Mercury Air Toxic or MATS rule. Our amendment in the nature of a substitute of this bill addresses the concerns raised about this bill last Congress. As I mentioned at the hearing in September, H.R. 350, the RPM Act, seeks to clarify longstanding policy on vehicles modified exclusively for competition on racetracks. Never in the 47 history of the Clean Air Act has the agency enforced the anti-tampering provisions against vehicles that are taken off public roads and driven exclusively on raceways. But in 2015, the agency inserted language into an unrelated proposed rule suggesting a change in policy. While the EPA later retracted that language, it did so in a manner that left unclear the legal status of the owners of these cars and motorcycles, as well as businesses that serve them. The RPM Act would make that cloud disappear and make it clear that the agency's hands-off policy is indeed the law. All these bills provide the necessary leeway and flexibility to smaller entities so that they can meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act without experiencing needless regulatory burdens. For this reason, it is imperative that we report these bills today so that we can help the many small businesses throughout the country that are being threatened by unreasonable regulations. And with that, I'll end my statement and yield back my time and recognize my friend and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Hongro from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will consider four bills at today's markup that seek to amend and, in my opinion, undermine the Clean Air Act, including H.R. 1917, the BRIC Act, H.R. 1119, the Sense Act, H.R. 453, the Relief from New Source Performance Standards Act of 2017, and then finally H.R. 350, the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act of 2017. I have concerns with each of these bills, but I will try to keep these opening remarks brief. Broadly speaking, each bill seeks to give a carve-out under the Clean Air Act. While I know some members are sympathetic to the arguments from businesses, especially small businesses, we need to think about what is in the best interest of all Americans. We know that delaying Clean Air Act rules negatively impacts on public health. So, ultimately, postponing or undermining rules that seek to reduce hazardous air pollutants is not good for Americans. We also know that pollution can be a tremendous drag on our economy and productivity, causing respiratory illnesses, costly hospitalizations, missed school and work days, and even premature deaths. In October, the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health issued a report that found pollution has been linked to 9 million deaths worldwide in the year 2015. Air pollution was the chief culprit, accounting for 2/3 of deaths from pollution, some 6.5 million people. While the majority of these deaths were in developing countries, the United States was not immune. We should keep in mind how far we have come in this country to protect our health and clean up our air, while not losing sight that there is still more work to do. Unfortunately, that view has not been shared by the current EPA, which is now appointing members to the Scientific Advisory Board that believe the air is too clean. I don't share that view, and neither do the doctors and scientists that have testified before this subcommittee in recent years on the Clean Air Act, including on the bills before us today. Our country can do better than the status quo, and in recent years, the EPA has worked hard to develop protections that will continue the decades-long trend of improving our nation's air quality, during which time our economy has continued to grow. The Clean Air Act has been about making progress over time. The longer we delay new standards, the longer our constituents are forced to live with unhealthy levels of air pollution. So I want to reiterate my initial concerns with the bills before us today. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this markup today. As you know, we're considering 4 pieces of legislation that I think make common sense adjustments to preserve small businesses and jobs while still maintaining important environmental protections. Now, these bills address the impact of regulations and policies aimed at brick makers, coal refuse to energy plants, the amateur racing industry, and of particular importance to many in rural Oregon, wood stoves. You know, in many parts of the state I'm from, we're surrounded by forests, and there's lots of wood around, and wood heat is a pretty important part of the way people can afford to keep their homes and their ranch shops warm in the winter. But Oregonians in some of these areas know all too well how expensive, burdensome regulations could be, and in areas like Lakeview and Klamath Falls have found themselves facing no good option between risking air quality restrictions that could prohibit economic growth or forcing residents to purchase expensive new wood stoves that meet new regulations. These communities ended up spending $1.5 million to help those consumers afford the new stoves. Now, some argue Congress has no role modifying EPA rules, and we should simply wait it out while legal challenges work their way through the courts or while EPA completes its reconsideration process of these policies. With respect to the issues and legislation being addressed today, I simply disagree. After all, it was Congress that delegated to EPA its authority under the Clean Air Act, and Congress has the right and the duty to step in when we see this authority being misused in ways that threaten small businesses and jobs. Furthermore, time is short, and there's no guarantee that either the courts or the agency will act soon enough to prevent plant closures and pink slips. Some have claimed these bills represent a rollback of environmental and public health protections, but we need to maintain a sense of perspective. For one thing, none of the 4 sectors at issue are a significant source of emissions. For example, coal refuse to energy plants represent about 0.5% of the nation's coal-fired capacity. And vehicles modified to be used exclusively for competition are even a smaller fraction of the 250 million vehicles owned by Americans. Additionally, many of these businesses face other measures that restrict emissions. The brick industry has already reduced emissions by nearly 95%, according to a study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Perhaps most importantly, none of these bills repeals any regulation. They simply make targeted adjustments in order to reduce the risk of plant shutdowns and layoffs. I conclude by noting that EPA recently updated its air quality trends to include the 2016 data, and the news is very good. Air pollution continues to decline, and that includes nearly all the emissions at issue today. The data show that there is no environmental justification for inflicting this economic harm on small businesses in the communities where they're located, and thus there's every reason to pass these bills to ensure that such harm is avoided. That, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's markup is another disappointing effort by the committee to advance bills to undermine public health protections and erode our progress on clean air. 2 of these bills were considered by the committee in the last Congress, H.R. 1119, the Sense Act, and H.R. 1917, the BRIC Act, and I opposed these bills in the last Congress, and I oppose them now. The Sense Act would allow power plants that burn coal refuse to emit higher levels of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen chloride, 2 dangerous air pollutants. It does this by revising both the mercury and air toxic standards rule and the cross-state air pollution rule, and this bill is a sweetheart deal for a small group of power plants that will result in more air pollution. As a congressman from a downwind state, I'm particularly concerned about this bill. Pollution generated west of New Jersey moves into our airshed, jeopardizing public health. It also increases the regulatory burden on New Jersey businesses that will be asked to do more to compensate for the extra pollution generated by these plants. The majority is expected to propose an amendment in the nature of a substitute that strikes all the changes of the cross-state air pollution rule from the bill. And this is a positive development, but the harmful changes to the mercury and air toxic rule remain in place, and so I continue to oppose the bill. H.R. 1917, the BRIC Act, is another matter. While there are special circumstances related to the rule for brick and clay ceramic manufacturing, this bill is not the way to address the problem. It sets a dangerous precedent that would encourage endless legal challenges designed to stall compliance with important safeguards. And this issue currently is before the courts, and that is where the issue should be resolved. A few weeks ago, we held a hearing about the many dangers associated with forest fires. The western states in particular have experienced another record year of fires with tragic consequences, including widespread and persistent air pollution. So it's difficult to understand why we'd want to consider H.R. 453, the Relief from New Source Performance Standards Act. This bill delays the rule to improve the efficiency and emissions performance of wood stoves, hydronic heaters, and forced air furnaces. Any delay in this rule will allow less efficient stoves and heaters that pollute the air to be on the market for 3 additional years. And because these appliances last for decades, it will take far longer to reduce pollution from these sources. It makes no sense to me why we would want to add more pollution from wood burning, especially when there are manufacturers producing compliant appliances today. These standards have not been updated since 1988, nearly 30 years ago. Furthermore, these new standards do not even begin to apply until 2020. All H.R. 453 really does is punish manufacturers who invested in cleaner, more efficient technologies and increase dangerous air pollution. There's no justification for extending the deadline for these standards and no need for this bill, and that's why I oppose it. And finally, we have H.R. 350, the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act of 2017. The need for this bill has been exaggerated. Nothing in the Clean Air Act prevents anyone from racing a vehicle professionally or as an amateur. Motorsports are not in jeopardy, but air quality will be if we pass H.R. 350 in its current form. The devices which are marketed and installed on a vehicle to improve its performance for racing are emission-controlled defeat devices. This is the same type of device that led to significant fines and loss of consumer confidence for Volkswagen because they result in much higher pollution. If someone installs these devices on a vehicle, that vehicle should no longer be driven for daily use on public roads. If a car is modified into a dedicated race car, then it should only be used on a track. H.R. 350 creates a loophole in the Clean Air Act that is too broad to ensure these devices will only be installed in dedicated racing cars. However, I believe we can find a bipartisan solution that would result in widespread support for H.R. 350. And Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to work with you towards that goal. I know you've talked about it, and I hope we'll be able to take the opportunity to improve this bill before it's considered by the full committee. But I can't support the bill in its current form that facilitates emissions cheating, and that's what H.R. 350 does. Exempting businesses from clean air rules leads to more air pollution. Air pollution damages people's health. Relaxing air standards for businesses does not reduce costs. It merely transfers them from business to individuals who will pay for the excess air pollution with more doctor visits and more lost work or school days. And so I urge my colleagues to join me in rejecting these bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio. We'll go back and forth. Gentleman from Ohio for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this markup today. These bills before us will help provide relief to many small businesses and industries across the country, particularly those that have been unfortunately subjected to federal regulations that don't make a whole lot of sense. For instance, the BRIC Act will simply allow for the consideration and completion of any judicial review regarding EPA's 2015 emission standards for the brick and tile industries before requiring compliance with their new rules. We don't want a repeat of the last time the EPA issued regulations for these industries, where the industry was forced to comply, spend hundreds of millions of dollars, only to have the rule vacated by the courts soon thereafter. Let's give the brick industry, the tile industry, and others who are affected by this rule some certainty, and let's let them compete on a fair and level playing field in the global economy. Let's not give history the chance to repeat itself and allow the courts to review the rule first. This bipartisan legislation does not set a dangerous precedent. These industries find themselves in a very unique situation, something I think my friends across the aisle recognize. Look, we understand the need to keep our air clean, to keep the water clean. Nobody understands that better than those of us who live in Appalachia and have to breathe the air and drink the water. But this is just common sense. And with that in mind, I hope we can work together, Mr. Chairman, on a unique solution, and I urge everyone to support this bill today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes I believe the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, was requesting time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I have concerns that some of the bills we are marking up today would harm the public's health. Although it is important that we consider updates to the clean air, we must not undermine its core mission of protecting the air we breathe. As you know, as an emergency physician, I care deeply about the health of our communities and the public health hazards that increased air pollutants threaten. I treated patients suffering from asthma attacks, respiratory infections, and even children with stunted lung development exacerbated by increased pollution in the air that we breathe. But respiratory illnesses caused by air pollution are preventable through proper safeguards like those in the Clean Air Act. We should not be debating the delay of these logical protections so industries like coal can forego the cost of compliance and profit at the expense of the public's health. Rural and underserved populations across our nation already struggle with health hazards that stem from environmental injustices such as increased asthma rates for the poor, air quality, or lead poisoning from contaminated water sources. Vulnerable communities should not be forced to bear the burden of the increased pollution that will result from delaying compliance with Clean Air Act regulations. That's exactly why I recently introduced H.R. 4114, the Environmental Justice Act, which will require the consideration of cumulative environmental impacts on a community when applying for clean air permits. We should not weaken the existing safeguards. Instead, we should be doing more to strengthen the life-saving regulations to keep our clean and safe air clean and safe for everyone to breathe. Why are we rewarding the few companies that fail to invest in cleaner appliances or emission reduction at the expense of the public's health? We need to support the common sense solutions because everyone, no matter where they live, their socioeconomic status, or their background, deserves a safe and healthy environment to live, work, and play. Lives are at stake if we continue to delay compliance with life-saving Clean Air Act regulations. We cannot afford to continue dragging our feet. We must and can do more. I hope that we can work together to protect our nation's health and ensure all cities across our nation have clean air. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair looks to the majority side, recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus. Thank you for holding this markup today. As we consider these important bills before us, I want to bring special attention to H.R. 350, the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports, or the RPM Act. Across North Carolina, there are 27,000 residents who are employed in motorsports-related jobs. My district is home of the motorsports racing industry and Charlotte Motor Speedway, and I'm proud to be their voice here in Washington. In July 2015, the EPA issued a proposed regulation that would prohibit the conversion of emission-certified vehicles into race cars for competition. The proposed regulation also prevented the sale or use of emissions-related race parts for these modified vehicles. This proposal violated the explicit intent of Congress in the last reauthorization of the Clean Air Act and sparked significant opposition from both members of Congress and the general public. Fortunately, EPA removed the provision from the final rule. Despite this public pushback, the agency still has not abandoned its interpretation of the Clean Air Act and contends that it is illegal to sell legitimate racing parts for use in converted motor vehicles, and that installation of these parts is an act of tampering. I heard the concerns of our ranking member today, but I wish to reassure you, Mr. Chairman, this interpretation by the EPA directly conflicts with the original purpose of the Clean Air Act and Congress's repeated efforts to clarify that these standards were never intended to apply to vehicles modified for racing only. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common sense legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair looks to the minority side, seeing no one wishing to speak. Oh, Doris, Mr. Green. Speak up there, Mr. Green. Chair recognizes Mr. Green from Texas for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're marking up 4 different bills today that in some way involve the Clean Air Act. Unfortunately, I do not believe that the language of these bills is adequate to be supported on a bipartisan basis. H.R. 1917, the Blocking Regulatory Interference from Closing Kills BRIC Act, delays the implementation of the final brick and structural clay products rule, as well as the final clay ceramics manufacturing rule. Many on this committee argued that legislation is needed until all legal challenges are resolved in the courts. However, legal challenges to the EPA rules is nothing new and we haven't seen before, and I don't think it meets the merit for legislative action to delay the rule. H.R. 453, the Relief of New Source Performance Standards Act of 2017, delays the SEP 2 compliance date for 3 categories of wood-fueled heaters from 2020 to 2023. This rule, finalized in March 2015, updates the standards that haven't been changed since 1988 and would result in emissions reductions as well as already seeing across many states who have adopted similar state-level rules. While I'm sympathetic to those who own these stove standards that have not been updated in nearly 20 years, simply don't meet the clean air standards of today. H.R. 350, the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act of 2017, modifies the regulation of emissions control systems on race cars and the parts that modify them. Amateur racing is a proud history in our country and in my state. I know there's a multitude of fans in every state that has a vested interest in this. I want to be clear, my no vote today on this bill is not against amateur racing. I worked with SEMA last Congress to pass legislation on low-volume classic vehicles, and I hope I can later support this bill as it makes its way through the committee process. Right now, the bill is lacking language that would prohibit the driving of these vehicles on public roads after they're converted into race cars. We've seen that a similar system works well in California, but does not exist in all 50 states. It's my hope that the majority will begin to work on a bipartisan basis on this bill so we can pass this with a consensus on both sides. Lastly, H.R. 1119, the Satisfying Energy Needs Savings Environmental Act, since we love our names in Congress, will provide special consideration under the EPA's cross-state air pollution rule for coal refuse plant. It's my opinion that the bill removes economic incentives for coal refuse plants to reduce their pollution and is another attack on the progress we've made in reducing emissions in recent years. And I do not support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to start by thanking you and the committee for holding today's markup and allowing us to address a number of outstanding concerns impacting our nation's job creators. In today's hearing, we'll be examining 4 bills that will amend onerous regulations, slowing job growth without any beneficial applications. The Blocking Regulatory Interference from Closing Kilns, introduced by my friend Bill Johnson, will help prevent the brick and clay industries from being subjective to these standards until a review of the rule is complete. The Relief from New Source Performance Standards Act amends the compliance dates for residential wood heaters, helping to ensure those remain available for people who need them. The RPM Act will address regulations for recreational racing, recognizing the industry and defining the difference between those and performance automobiles. The Sense Act will amend the standards for coal refuge power plants, helping to ensure Americans get the power they need every day. Mr. Chairman, today's hearings represent an opportunity for this committee to continue to address burdensome rules and regulations that are preventing industries in this country from growing due to technical concerns. I thank my colleagues for their introduction of today's bills, and I urge all my colleagues to support these efforts and help allow people to not only keep their jobs, but to expand upon them as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair looks to see if anyone else wishing to speak. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Matsuo, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose the bills before us today. They will undermine the Clean Air Act provisions that have been proven to reduce pollution and emissions and improve public health. In particular, I'm concerned about the impacts of the Relief from New Source Performance Standards Act, the BRIC Act, and the SENSE Act. My district in Sacramento sits in California's Central Valley, which traps both local pollution as well as ozone and particulate matter produced in other parts of the state. The local governments in my district have worked hard to address air quality challenges because they understand that our children and grandchildren will live better lives if we clean up the air now. In Sacramento, we face health risks associated with air pollution during every season of the year. In the summer, the cars, trucks, buses, and heavy equipment on our roads and in our fields make it hard to breathe and increase the risk of heart attacks. In the winter, the majority of air pollution comes from residential fireplaces and wood stoves. That's why it is important that our local air quality district incentivizes the replacement of older, inefficient wood stoves with cleaner models. This is a type of forward-thinking progress we need to embrace. But the bills before us today are not forward-thinking. This legislation would ultimately make the air my constituents breathe dirtier, effectively reversing some of the progress we've made with the Clean Air Act. That moves us in the wrong direction at a time when we need to be working together to fight our changing climate for future generations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back her time. Chair is looking on both sides. Seeing no one, the chair then calls up H.R. 1917 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1917, to allow for judicial review of any final rule addressing national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants for brick and structural clay products or for clay ceramics manufacturing before requiring compliance with such rule.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments? The question,
Mr.
we're
Chair,
up to the gentleman from New York.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The BRIC Act would delay implementation of EPA's brick and structural clay products rule until all legal challenges are resolved. Delaying this standard will continue to delay the health protections that it provides. But just as troubling, this bill incentivizes frivolous litigation to delay compliance. The Clean Air Act allows for delays of implementation of rules if litigants can provide good reasons, and judges have issued stays in the past. At this point, as far as I'm aware, no one has petitioned the court to stay the BRIC rule. Let's not insert Congress into a situation which can and should be resolved by the courts. On top of that, I believe this bill creates a bad precedent that could be applied to other standards. And with that, I urge members to oppose the bill. And, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey. For what purpose?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, my Republican colleagues, in describing the need for this bill, say that it's necessary in order to delay the EPA's Brick and Clay Act until all judicial review has been completed. But that's completely false. The courts already have the ability to issue a stay of any compliance dates in a final rule as necessary to protect the public interest. That's their job, and we should let them do it. We all know there have already been challenges filed regarding this final rule. It will be up to the D.C. Circuit, when they review these challenges, to decide whether to stay the rule. Well-established legal factors exist for granting a stay. These factors take into account whether there's a likelihood of success on the merits, the prospect of irreparable harm to the moving party and other parties, and most importantly, whether granting the stay is in the public interest. The courts have used these factors time and again to determine whether to grant a stay and for how long. So there's no reason for Congress to override this process and the judgment of the court. I really think before we rashly conclude on behalf of the D.C. Circuit that the compliance deadlines for the BRIC-MAC final rule should be extended, we should let them take a look at the final rule. And ultimately, if a stay is necessary, the court can grant it, not the Congress. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone seek time? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio. For what purpose?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, you know, what we're trying to do here with the BRIC Act is just simply apply common sense. Many of these tile and brick manufacturing companies are the lifeblood of the communities in which they do business. They are the major job employers or the job creators for those areas. And we got to look back and remember what happened several years ago. A 2003 rule, later vacated by a federal court, has already reduced emissions by up to 95%, and that's according to a Chamber of Commerce study. The EPA has estimated that the new BRIC MAC rule would reduce further emissions of mercury by only 147 pounds per year. That's nearly 100 times less than the agency estimates will be reduced from power plants. And fine particulate matter emissions are about 500 times less than those emitted from fast food restaurants, according to the U.S. Chamber. This rule, if it goes into effect the way it is, and if we don't give the courts an opportunity to take a look at it before before the administration or before the agency makes any more moves, it's going to have devastating financial impacts on a business sector of our economy that cannot afford another false move or another rule rollback that they're not going to be able to get recovery from. So again, Mr. Chairman, we're just trying to apply some common sense here and let the courts have their day in court to determine whether or not this rule should go forward or not. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone seeking time? Seeing none. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1917 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Those no.
Mr. Chair, request a roll call vote.
Roll call vote's been requested. The clerk will request a roll call vote.
Mr. McKinley? Aye. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Harper? Mr. Olson? Aye. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Flores? Aye. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Chairman Walden? Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas votes no. Ms. Dingell? Ms. Dingell votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus?
Shimkus votes yes.
Chairman Shimkus votes yes. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye.
Is everyone recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 12 and the nays were 10.
The ayes are 12, the nays are 10. The bill is passed without objection. Motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I'm guessing all this stuff here. Chair now calls up H.R. 453 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 453, to deem the Step 2 compliance date for standards of performance for new residential wood heaters, new residential hydraulic heaters, and forced air furnaces to be May 15, 2023.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any other amendments? Is there further discussion on the bill before us? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 53 as 453 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye.
Mr.
Those
Chair,
opposed,
I ask for a recorded vote, please.
gentlemen request recorded vote. Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett. Ms. Daggett votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus.
Chairman Shimkus votes aye.
Chairman Shimkus votes aye.
Anyone else wishing to record their vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 12 and the nays were 10.
Ayes are 12, the nays are 10. The ayes have it, the bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 350 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 350, to exclude vehicles used solely for competition from certain provisions of the Clean Air Act and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none. Are there any other amendments? Seeing, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Michigan rise and seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in very reluctant opposition to H.R. 350 because I'm a car girl. And while I support the goals of the bill, I fear it's drafted too broadly and could have some unintended consequences moving forward. I understand what the authors of the legislation are trying to accomplish. Like you, I love my afternoons at the Michigan International Speedway, and I go a lot with my friends. I come from the home of the auto industry where cars are a way of life. And a lot of my constituents and people I went to school with are amateur racers, and we're still racing at this age. Okay, I don't do it anymore. But I'm afraid the bill goes too far and could have unintended consequences on EPA's ability to crack down on the bad actors. I would respectfully request we work together to pursue a simple, targeted change to ensure that vehicle conversions are legal as long as they're on the tracks and are not permitted on public roads. I'm worried that the bill we're considering today is a bit broader than that, and I fear it could have a negative impact on EPA's ability to enforce the law by people who do not have the best of intentions at heart. Mr. Chairman, I want to protect the amateur racers that I know and love, that I know are in North Carolina too, but not allow people who want to modify them for other reasons, and we know they're out there too. So, Mr. Chairman, would you be willing to work with me to address some of the concerns that I've raised about the bill before it goes to full committee markup? Because I do think we can get there, and I do support the goals of the bill. And I yield to you.
Thank you, the gentlelady. We always are looking forward to be constructive as we move forward. So the answer is yes, but but I can't commit to what that might be. I would want to make sure that we call in, obviously, the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Hudson, and if I will yield to him if he wants to make any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the spirit with which the gentlelady brings up these concerns. You know, although the 1970 Clean Air Act left unclear whether motor vehicles could be modified for racing, the agency has never taken enforcement action against anyone for doing so. In 2015, the EPA suggested that their hands-off policy may be coming to an end. The RPM Act would create an explicit exemption of the Clean Air Act's anti-tampering provisions if done for the purpose of modifying a motor vehicle solely for the use in competition. The RPM Act would also redefine the Clean Air Act's definition of motor vehicle to exclude vehicles used solely for competition. So again, we tried to address the concerns the gentlelady expressed, but obviously I'm willing to work with the gentlelady to see if we could get to a point where we can come together, and I appreciate her willingness to let us move forward today.
And I'm going to vote no today with the hopes we can work so we get to a yes at full committee. I've talked to many of those same people, and I think there's a place we can get working together. I hope. Thanks. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I move.
And the gentlelady yields back her time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could I yield to my colleague?
You could. You have a minute.
I yield to Mr.
Thank you. I agree with much of what my colleague said, although I never raced. But I think it's important for us to come together on this, and I agree with her sentiment, and thank you for your commitment as the author of the bill and also Chairman to work with us, as many of us on this side of the aisle, so we can come to the point where we could actually vote for the bill. I was looking forward to voting for a bill that would be a bit tighter than this, but appropriate. So hopefully we can come together and work on it so that by the time it gets to the full floor of the House, we could actually all vote for this and we can move forward. Thank you very much. I yield back to the gentlelady.
Thank you very much. I have to go to the Michigan International Speedway again. I got to be able to look them in the face. So I hope we can get it resolved. Thank you. I now yield back.
Gentlelady yields back his time.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, I add my voice to those who are concerned that the measure is drafted too broadly. I understand the intent here, but I think that this bill as drafted would block EPA from using its one course of action to prevent the proliferation of defeat devices that's going after manufacturers. So if I'm hearing a commitment here to move forward, I would appreciate our efforts to continue to negotiate on this to make certain it's drafted appropriately. I too plan to vote no with the hopes that we'll further amend. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair appreciates the comments, and hopefully we can be helpful. Gentleman from California.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Listen, you know, I appreciate Representative Dingell's experience. I have experience in race car as well. My dad was actually a race car driver. He was an amateur race car driver, raced modified midgets. Believe it or not, he had me hold the flashlight at night till 11, 12 a.m. while he fixed his engine. And so I understand that, that culture, the industry, I'm a fan of racing as well. I believe that this bill is sending a clear message to industry and to race car drivers saying that if you modify your car, you can only use your car in the racetrack. And I think that that's an important first step. The second step that we need is clearly to address a problem that we have already with or without the bill, which is enforcing the Clean Air Act. And that's what this bill lacks. And that's specifically what people on this side of the aisle would like to see addressed with the improvement of this bill. There's been some talk before this hearing with Ranking Member and Representative Hudson, and the goodwill of coming together and adding some enforceable strength and muscle to this bill. This is a trust issue. This is about being able to work in good faith and making public statements saying that you will be willing to change this bill in order to add the teeth that we need. I am going to support the bill, but specifically with looking at you in the eye, knowing that you are going to make a strong commitment to help us be able to enforce the Clean Air Act to ensure that step 2 for this clear statement is made. You got that?
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Let's say that we're willing to talk. Every state has a different way of compliance. We know that we can move the bill. We'd rather move it with you, but we want to make sure not to make such strong commitments that causes us not to be on board.
Well, I'll tell you what, because I'd like you to help your cause right now, Mr. Chairman. I would like you and Representative Hudson to commit truly to sit down with us and help us address the enforcement aspect that is lacking in this bill so that we have the two-pronged protection approach. The first is specifically send a clear message to industry and amateur drivers that if they change and they use their cars to race, that it's off limits on the road. That's something that we can agree with. But two is that we close a potential loophole which will add enforcement protections so that we can truly keep those cars off the road. Will we have those discussions?
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
We are happy to have discussions in a bipartisan manner to see if we can get to a common ground where we all move forward. I don't want to commit our side into any strength of statement today, but I think we can talk. I think everyone has a position that we want our race car drivers to be able to race. We want them to be able to modify. We understand that it's illegal to use it on streets. But we're not really the party that really wants to ramp up an EP regulatory regime that grows, right?
Well, I'm going to claim back my time if that's okay.
Yes, sir.
With you, sir. So I can tell you that in the way you handle these negotiations in good faith and whether or not there's going to be some enforcement, you're going to gain some votes, you're going to lose some votes when it really matters, and that's going to be on the House floor. And then if you don't get some bipartisan support, then it could very well fail in the Senate, and this will never see the light of day. And so I'm trying to help create a bipartisan support so that you can get more votes on the floor, because my vote isn't guaranteed on the House floor if these provisions aren't inserted.
Would gentleman yield? As a wise old member of this committee once told me, if we want a bill to become a law, we have to work together. And we've been able to do that successfully, but I can't commit that we're always successful. I can commit that we'll try.
Well, you got to give us a little more confidence. Thank you. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Okay, gentleman yields back his time. Anyone else seeking time? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you. I yield my time to Ms. Dingle.
I just wanted to clarify in that conversation. I think we're more worried about people who are modifying their vehicles not to race, but then to go out on the road. And I know that you are committed to getting that fixed. And having talked to multiple stakeholders in this over the last few days, I'm hopeful that there is something that we can agree with and we are able to make sure people can race cars, but aren't going to have people modifying their vehicles for other reasons out on the road. We don't see more Volkswagens others are raising the kinds of questions that we have unfortunately seen of OEMs modifying vehicles and getting potentially so. I'm hopeful there's quick, easy ground for us to all come to agreement on.
Gentlelady yield?
I will.
I agree.
I yield. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. The question now, seeing no one else wishing to speak, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 350 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Gentleman from New York requests a roll call vote. The clerk will will call the roll.
Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Pallone. No. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus.
Yes.
Chairman Shimkus votes aye.
Anyone else wishing to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 9.
The ayes 13, the nays are 9. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 1119 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1119, to establish the basis by which the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency shall issue, implement, and enforce certain emission limitations and allocations for existing electric utility steam generating units that convert coal refuse into energy.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill would be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1119, offered by Mr. Shimkus.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the chair is recognizing myself for 5 minutes in support of the amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute addresses concerns raised by our friends on the other side of the aisle over the cross-state air pollution rule, CASPR, provisions in the original bill. On the floor last year, 2 amendments were offered, one to remove those provisions and another to allow states to opt out of those provisions. This amendment took the first approach and removed all references to CASPR. So the amendment in the nature of a substitute will only address the mercury air toxic standards, MATS, while all coal refuse-fired plants can meet the mercury standard under MATS. Some cannot meet the MATS hydrogen chloride standard, providing an alternative compliance mechanism that these specialized facilities can meet. This amendment will facilitate the beneficial cleanup of coal refuse sites by allowing that refuse to be utilized in power generation. I hope with this change, all our colleagues can support this bill. And with that, are there any bipartisan amendments to the amendment? Are there any other amendments? If there are no further discussions, the vote occurs on the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. And then pin the chair. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. And the amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs, are there any other amendments to the bill? The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1119 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor say aye.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Those opposed, no. Chairman.
Request a roll call.
The gentleman from New York requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Burton. Mr. Burton votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Ms. Dingle. Ms. Dingle votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus. Chairman Shimkus votes aye.
Anyone else wishing to record their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 10.
Ayes are 13, the nays are 10. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.